It's day 5 of our summer 7-day session, the 16th of January 2014. And we're going to take up another story from The Hidden Lamp, Stories from 25 Centuries of Awakened Women, edited by Florence Kaplow and Susan Moon. This one is called Fa Xiang's Recognition, and it's from 5th century China. The nun Fa Xiang often shared her clothing and food, giving the best to the nun Hui Se. The other nuns admonished Fa Xiang, saying, "The nun Hui Se is uncultivated and inarticulate. When she wanted to study meditation, no one would give her instruction because she is the worst of idiots. Why don't you sow the seeds of generosity in a more spiritually worthy field?" Fa Xiang responded, "One would have to be a saint to know the spiritual accomplishments of the recipient of donations. I'm a very ordinary person, so I'd rather do it this way." Later, Hui Se sponsored a 7-day meditation retreat with the community. On the 3rd night, when the others arose from meditation, she did not get up, remaining in a deep meditation state until the end of the retreat. It was only then that the other nuns saw Hui Se's extraordinary abilities, and for the first time they understood Fa Xiang's insight. There's a little bit of biographical material on these two. Fa Xiang's dates are 375 to 453, and her name means mark of the law. She was from northwest China, and she married, but when the Qin dynasty was overthrown, all her relatives either disappeared or died. She became a nun and lived at a Great Mysterious Terrace Convent, which is the theme for this story. Hui Se, we don't have exact dates for her, and she's really known mainly for her role in the life of Fa Xiang. She lived with Fa Xiang in the same convent and was seen as poor, ineducable, possible to educate practitioner before surprising the nuns with her deep meditation practice. So that's our story. So we're told in the story that Fa Xiang would give the best of what she received in donations to this other nun, Hui Se. There is a kind of economy even in monasteries and convents, and no doubt Fa Xiang got more donations because she was higher status. And so she shared this stuff with others in the convent. But when the other nuns saw her donating to this particular nun, they complained. "Why are you giving her this stuff? She's not worthy of your donations. Why don't you sow the seeds of generosity in a more spiritually worthy field?" And this idea comes out of a notion that was prevalent in Buddhism and was and is, and that is that it's better to give not to the needy, but to the spiritually pure, the spiritually advanced, because that way you you make more merit yourself. These nuns call as their fellow practitioner here the worst of idiots. The worst of idiots. Uncultivated and inarticulate. They're being what my mother would have called uncharitable. And this word charity is an interesting one because we usually think of it as being giving donations, but actually it's a Christian word for love, very akin to loving kindness. So they were being ungenerous in their estimation of this nun. They were seeing the worst, really, in her. They were seeing her worst characteristics. And no doubt there was some jealousy here. Fa Shang's giving to Hui, so she's not giving stuff to me. It's not fair. You might think that this is kind of inappropriate for a nunnery convent. But this sort of thing, one finds this sort of thing in any close community, anywhere where people are living together at close quarters, Zen centres. Certainly, I saw lots of petty stuff in the many years that we trained in Rochester. People comparing themselves to others, getting resentful when the teacher would give a certain job to somebody and not to somebody else, not to them usually. And it's probably fair to say that religious communities may actually be worse in this regard, in terms of judging others, because religious communities usually have pretty strong ideas about right and wrong, good and bad, and this can lead to harsh judgments. People who come for religious training can be pretty idealistic people, and this is always a source of harsh judgment, both of others and of oneself. But it is an irony to see this sort of thing happening. The reason for coming into a convent or a monastery or a Zen center is to work on liberating oneself from suffering. We do this in community because we can then support each other in this endeavor. So it's really working at cross purposes to a reason for being in a community is to then get caught up in this kind of way of thinking, in a way of thinking that divides, makes comparisons, and often based on prejudice. In Ajahn Suchito's article that we've been reading about, he makes a comment that seems to fit this story like a glove. He says, all beings seek their own welfare. Suffering and the pressure to get free of it are the concern of us all. So surely we could get together to support each other. And yet we often focus on the ways that set us apart. That focus brings even more suffering in terms of comparative judgments, which bring competition and conflict. Yet, on the other hand, when there is empathy, even at the times when we experience bereavement, pain and fear, the suffering diminishes. There is nothing like a struggle shared that is so conducive to trust, strength and uplift. Consider the stories of explorers who against extremity struggle through to safety together, shared conflict brings about fellow feeling with its tremendous mutual strengthening. When the boundary of concern widens to include others, even to the point of those who we're in conflict with, in an important respect, the suffering ceases. This is the suffering that the Buddha pointed out as something that we can bring to cessation. And in doing that, we're not just released from pain, we are broadened and deepened out of alienation and into wisdom and compassion. So this is the potential. But the reality is that if we do come into a religious community, we bring with us all the habits of mind that make us suffer, that often the ones that were motivating factors to our wanting to engage in training. And then these things, of course, come into play in the way that we interact with other people. We come into a training environment not very good at going about the ways to reduce our suffering. So though we are all supposed to be working together on the great matter of birth and death, we get caught up in jealousy and envy and other things like this. The secret is to look at all of this stuff, to try and really see it clearly, see what's going on. Ajahn Suchato says, so there is great practical wisdom in understanding how the mind creates boundaries of concern and interest and how we work with these. There are boundaries. There are other beings on earth. Once we consider otherness, the ways beings are different from us, we can feel either insecurity, how does she compare with me, or contempt, you're not as good as me, or fear and intimidation, you're better or stronger than me, or adoration, attraction, I want to be bonded to you. These immediate assumptions are called conceit. That is, we conceive of people as worse, better, or the same as us. And this is a classical teaching from the Pali tradition, known as the three conceits. I'm better than you, I'm worse than you, or I'm equal to you. Or sometimes here he's got I'm the same as you, sometimes translated as I'm as good as you. And in our story, the nuns had come to the conclusion that they were better than Huesa. She was an idiot. And so they could feel good about themselves when they looked down on her. We do this all the time with people. We kind of size it up and we draw conclusions about the other person. These conclusions can be based on all kinds of things. It can be race or gender, class, wealth, sexual orientation, power, status, or often some kind of cocktail of several of the above. Huesa was probably a peasant, illiterate, uneducated, as they say. I don't know what Chinese temples were like in the 5th century, but in European monasteries and convents in medieval times and more recently, the class system was very much a part of the structure of the monastery or convent. There would be two kinds of monks and nuns. There would be ones who came from the aristocracy and were in the positions of power, and then there would be a kind of servant class, a second class nun or monk who would do the heavy work around the scrubbing and the cooking and the farming. Even if this sort of division didn't exist in Chinese temples, and certainly in Chan temples there was very great emphasis put on everybody doing the work of the temple, the manual labour. We can be sure that even if it wasn't structural, and I don't know whether it was or not, there would still have been these kinds of distinctions, because people don't leave these things at the door when they enter a monastery. You can give a modern example of this at the Zen Center. There was quite a lot of Mexicans would come for training, because there was big center or group in Mexico City, and from time to time there would be real tensions between the Mexicans and the Americans, because there's such a long history of tension, of domination of Mexico by the U.S. and of oppression of Mexicans through the American laws around immigration and labor and so forth. And these things would sometimes flare up at the center. Americans would make assumptions about the Mexicans, and there could be this kind of subtle looking down on them. And the Mexicans would be very sensitive to how they were treated because of this long history. And a lot of this stuff came out of these three conceits. I'm better, I'm worth, or I'm as good as. Ajahn Sucitto says the effect of these conceits is the mind's responsiveness gets stuck. It doesn't see the rich or successful with compassion for their suffering. It doesn't value the beauty, humour or resilience of those worse than me. And it doesn't respect the differences of those who I see as the same as me. Caught in the conceit of self-view, the heart doesn't extend its boundaries of appreciation and concern. We take each other for granted as my wife, my boss, my teacher. And that fixing of them freezes our sensitivity. In that state, the heart easily tips over into complaining about the other not being the way they should be, or rather the way I want them to be, and so becomes a breeding ground for ill will. When there's a lot of ill will, it's like we see people in just one dimension. We see their faults, we see their how they've wronged us. We dwell on that, and they lose their roundedness. The nuns saw Huesa as a kind of caricature, not a whole person. For them, she was just the worst of idiots. She was maybe the convent idiot, as there used to be a village idiot. And appreciate that label did not reflect anything real. It didn't have a referent. It was It was an opinion that these nuns had. In the same way that when we say I, that actually doesn't refer to something real. It's something we create. It's a fictional creation. Fa Xiang's response to the nuns suggests another possibility. When they ask her, why don't you sow the seeds of generosity in a more spiritually worthy field? She replies, one would have to be a saint to know the spiritual accomplishments of the recipient of donations. I'm a very ordinary person, so I'd rather do it this way. She's saying, who can know what the spiritual accomplishments of somebody are, unless there's a way beyond hers. Only a saint, only the Buddha would be able to see that. I'm different. I'm just an ordinary person. So I'd rather do it this way. I'd rather give. What's there in her response is a not knowing, a not making assumptions about the other person. She sees Huesa as somebody with an interior. She recognizes that. And she doesn't presume to be able to plumb those depths, but she knows they're there. She appreciates that. Ajahn Suchito tells a story of from his own monastery that depicts something very, very similar, an ability to see beyond the judgments and labels we put on people. He writes, as a Buddhist monastery is an open system, one gets many visitors, and not all of them are that balanced. A few years ago, a man I'll call Dennis used to frequent the monastery for some sort of companionship, but always grew loud, aggressive to others in the dorm, did what he felt was useful work, but which was actually counterproductive, and in general made a nuisance of himself until he'd leave, showering everyone with verbal abuse, until the next time. So when he turned up one day in the meeting hall, there were a few silent groans, and as he started waving his arms around and demanding attention, most people left. One of the monks stood firm and informed Dennis that his behaviour was inappropriate for a monastery, which got Dennis even more riled. I looked at this man with his demands, and my mind's lens seemed to widen. Poor guy, he must annoy so many people, and yet he obviously comes to the monastery for company. So I found myself coming right up to him and calling his name gently, taking him by the arm and walking around the hall with him, talking to him. I had no expectations. It was just a response, but the effect surprised me. His wildness diminished, his body tension eased. And as I commented that he wasn't a bad person at all, but that his behaviour frightened people, he came to a standstill. As I put my arm around his shoulder, he quietly slid down the wall to sit on the floor. In a few moments he had curled up and was sleeping like a baby. I laid a blanket over him. After a short nap, he woke up calm and coherent, stayed for tea, and then went home. He got what he'd been coming for after all those years. somehow Ajahn Sucitto was able to meet this man so that he felt seen and heard, embraced, enough so that he could sink down and take a nap at home for a little bit, feeling more at home with himself. Ajahn Sucitto was able to connect with the humanity in him rather than just seeing him as the crazy guy who comes and shouts and makes trouble. One of the reasons why it can be helpful to do metta is to prepare us for such situations, so that the sense of empathy or connection comes more naturally in our encounters. Ajahn Sucitto describes this as cultivating a conscious field of kindness. And it's a field in which not only are we able to meet difficult people like this guy with some empathy, but also scary, loud, disruptive aspects of ourselves. Of course, this is a long-term project. We've just barely scraped the surface in doing a little bit of metta a couple of times or once a day. Maybe it would come more naturally after a year or two. And it's challenging to do this practice, because in just turning our attention to loving kindness, we constellate its opposite: hatred, anger. That's why it's so useful, because it helps to illuminate a shadow, whatever is unredeemed in us. Ajahn Sucitto writes, "Of course we can't just bring kindness to others without having felt it in ourselves, which means that our limitations, fears, doubts and pains are an essential part of our field work." So a testing investigation is to check whether we have metta for ourselves and when we lose it. Do we beat ourselves up and feel guilty when we make a mistake, are late, or don't live up to others' expectations? Do we feel shadow impressions hovering around us over things we have or haven't done? Does our conceiving mind conceive of how great somebody else is and how inferior we are? The learning point is that as long as we pick up on and attach to particular features as self or other, good or bad, we never arrive at holistic goodwill. In that self-view, sooner or later, someone's going to be inferior and someone's superior. Very helpful when we start to see that it's the self and other, the good and bad, that are the problem. Our dualistic thinking, our separating the world in this way, rather than life. It's rather the interpretation that we put on it. A few days before Sesshin started, I did a 3-day mindfulness retreat out at Vimutti Forest Monastery in Bombay. And very similar to us. They have a fairly brief work period after breakfast every morning, and my job was to clean a shower, bathroom area, sink, toilet, and on the last morning, somebody had put the mirror, sort of small shaving mirror, on the windowsill, and when I was mopping the floor, I managed to knock the mirror out the window and fell down outside and was sort of damaged, partially broken. And I went and fetched it back, and then this strong feeling of shame came over me, and I imagined started to think about what they would think of me that had broken this mirror, that I was a clumsy, stupid, unmindful, and I realized that I was feeling like I had when I was 4 years old, when I had broken a Christmas decoration that was my mother's, that she was very fond of. It was a little silver teapot in that very glass-like, very fragile material that Christmas decorations used to be made of. And I was playing with it and dropped it, and it shattered into many, many pieces. And I felt this terrible shame and that I had done this. I did go to her very solemnly and tell her that I'd broken her favorite Christmas decoration. And she was, of course, she was very kind about it. She didn't scold me or anything. But there was a huge amount behind that feeling of shame. I now understand. It came out of some very strong and scary stories that I had been telling myself already for some years at the age of 4. And these had their source in being adopted. Two related stories, actually. One was, you've got to be a good girl. Actually, you've got to be a perfect little girl, because if you're not, then it might happen again. You might lose your parents. It happened once, it could happen again. So you better be perfect. And if you do lose your parents because you've not been a perfect girl, it'll be all your fault. Such heavy stuff for a 4-year-old to be thinking. And yet this is the sort of thing that can be behind a feeling of shame when, 50 odd years later, a habit of mind, a way of thinking that still has the potential to cause me suffering. But also, if I can see it clearly, then it also can help me to be more compassionate about what might be going on in somebody else when they get angry with me, or seem to be anxious for some reason. we can be sure that there are stories like this behind a lot of the unskillful things that people do. These kind of momentous, terrifying things that we tell ourselves. And behind those terrifying things, there will be events, things that happen to us. And while those events are things that actually happened, what we tell ourselves as a result are fictions, things that we created, they were ways that we coped with terrifying things that happened to us. In my case, the groundlessness of being separated from my mother. So I created this story that it was my fault. But the story is without ground. It's not based on something real. Through training our mind to pay attention, we can unravel this stuff. We can trace back to its source, these painful emotions and experiences we have. When we, as Ajahn Suchito puts it, they're an essential part of our field work. It is kind of archaeological process. We dig down and slowly uncover these things. Always in them there's dualism. Good girl, bad girl. My fault. The story has a kind of a fairy tale ending to it. Huesa sponsors a 7-day meditation retreat, and on the third night, when the others arose from meditation, she did not get up. She remained in a deep state of meditation until the end of the retreat. It was only then that the nuns saw Huesa's extraordinary abilities, and for the first time they understood Fa Xiang's insight. It's sort of like Cinderella, who was the ash-covered one. That's what her name means. And then she becomes the wife of the prince, the queen. The lowly one's true self is revealed. Huesa in the story she's really every woman, because this true self of hers that is revealed is something we all have. Fa Xiang saw this all along. She recognized this. That's really what her generosity consisted of. She saw Huesa for what she was. Extraordinary. Still, peaceful in her essential nature. Not coming or going. Just this, here and now. Also in this story we see the way in which generosity generates generosity. Fa Xiang, shares her clothing and food with Hui Se, and at a certain point Hui Se is inspired to sponsor a retreat, maybe even with the stuff, with the resources that Fa Shang has donated to her. We can also imagine her being pretty unconfident when she first comes along to the monastery, pretty retiring, especially since they refuse to even teach her how to meditate. But because of the treatment she gets from Fa Shang, her confidence grows to the point where she makes offerings so that this retreat can be held, and then throws herself into the practice. She finds the faith in herself to do this. It doesn't matter how many defilements we have. And we're all of us at times the worst of idiots. It's what it is really to be human, is to be idiot at times. But the very nature of our idiotic behavior it's the substance of our awakening. To see into our ignorance transforms it into wisdom. It can be really painful to really see how these stories we tell ourselves and how they distort things. Painful, confusing at times, but there's no other way to free ourselves. Carl Jung said, the only way out is through. Stop here and start the 4 vow.